The frozen river didn't make a sound when it gave way beneath the boy. There was only the sharp crack of ice, and then silence, a silence so absolute it seemed to swallow even the winter wind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Abigail Harlow would later say it was this silence that woke her, not any cry for help. Standing at her cabin window that bitter January morning, she witnessed a dark shape disappear through the white surface of the Blackwater River, and without thought, without hesitation, she ran. This single moment of instinctive compassion would forever alter the course of not just her life, but the fate of two peoples teetering on the edge of conflict. Winter had sunk its teeth deep into the Ozarks that year. 3 months of bitter cold had transformed Willow Creek from a bustling frontier settlement to a collection of smoke-plumed cabins scattered like afterthoughts across the snow-covered valley. The kind of cold that made men whisper about omens and women lay extra herbs beneath their doorways. The kind that turned thoughts inward and made neighbors strangers. For Abigail Harlow, the cold was a companion more familiar than unwelcome. Since Thomas's passing 2 winters prior, she had grown accustomed to solitude. Her cabin stood apart from the others, perched on a ridge overlooking the Blackwater River, where it bent around ancient stone bluffs like a dark ribbon. The townsfolk called it Widow's Watch, partly for its vantage point, partly for the woman who stood sentinel there. At 34, Abigail was neither young enough to remarry easily nor old enough to be forgotten. She existed in that in-between space that frontier women often found themselves, useful for midwifery and healing, but otherwise left to tend their own affairs. She kept bees in summer, dried herbs in fall, and during the long winter months she carved. Small woodland creatures emerged from blocks of pine beneath her knife, foxes with alert ears, owls with knowing eyes, rabbits poised to flee. Thomas had taught her before the fever took him. Now her fingers remembered what her heart tried to forget. The morning the river broke began like any other. Abigail rose before dawn, stoked the dying embers in the hearth, and set water to boil. Her calico cat, Marmalade, pressed against her ankles as she moved about the cabin, his orange coat nearly glowing in the firelight. Outside, the world was still wrapped in darkness, the kind that seems permanent until it isn't. She sipped her tea by the east-facing window, waiting for the first hints of light to break over the ridge, when she saw it, movement on the frozen river below. At first, she thought it was a deer, perhaps driven by hunger to cross the ice in search of the winter berries that still clung to branches on the far bank. But the figure was too small, too deliberate in its movements. A child, a boy by the looks of it, picking his way carefully across the frozen surface. Even from this distance, Abigail could tell he was not from the settlement. His clothing was different, buckskins rather than homespun cloth, with fringe that caught the first rays of dawn. "Cherokee," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. The territorial boundaries between the settlers and the Cherokee had been drawn and redrawn so many times in recent years that few could say with certainty where one domain ended and another began. But one thing was known by all: the Blackwater River marked a boundary, and crossing it uninvited could be seen as provocation. Yet here was this child, alone in the half-light, venturing into land that wasn't his. Abigail watched, transfixed, as the boy paused mid-river. He knelt, clearing snow from the ice with his mittened hands. Fishing, she realized. He was checking one of the ice fishing holes that the men from town sometimes cut. This one had apparently frozen over again, and the boy was attempting to reopen it. The crack, when it came, seemed to split the air itself. One moment the child was kneeling, the next he was gone, with only a dark, jagged mouth in the ice to mark where he had been. Abigail moved without conscious thought. She grabbed her shawl, from its peg, thrust her feet into boots still stiff with cold, and flew out the door. The path from her cabin to the river was steep and treacherous, rocks and roots hidden beneath snow. She half ran, half slid down the embankment, her breath coming in sharp clouds before her face. "Hold on!" she called, though she knew the child couldn't hear. "Please hold on!" The ice near the break was thin, spreading with hairline cracks like a spider's web. Abigail dropped to her belly, spreading her weight as she inched forward. The cold bit through her clothes, but she barely noticed. At the edge of the break, she plunged her arms into the black water, the shock of it stealing her breath. At first, she felt nothing. The current here was swift, and she feared the boy had already been swept downstream, beneath the ice where she couldn't reach. But then, a brush against her fingertips. Fabric. She grasped blindly and felt a solid form, with strength born of desperation. She heaved, pulling the child toward the surface. His face, when it emerged, was blue-tinged, eyes closed, not breathing. Abigail dragged him from the water and quickly away from the dangerous ice, her mind racing through the knowledge. Her grandmother had passed down. Get the water out, get him warm, keep him breathing. She turned him onto his side, patting his back firmly until water spilled from his mouth. Then she gathered him in her arms, so small, so terribly still, and began the arduous climb back to her cabin. By the time she crested the ridge, her muscles burned and her lungs ached, but the boy had begun to shiver. A good sign. The dead don't shiver. Inside the cabin, she stripped away his frozen clothes, wrapped him in her own quilts, and laid him before the hearth. She built up the fire until it roared, casting dancing shadows across the boy's face. Only then, in the warm light, did she truly look at him. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. His hair was black as a crow's wing, his skin the warm brown of river stones in summer. His features were delicate, almost fragile in unconsciousness. A small leather pouch hung from a cord around his neck, miraculously still in place despite his ordeal. As she rubbed warmth back into his small limbs, Abigail's mind turned to the implications of what she had done. Taking in a Cherokee child, even one at death's door, would not be looked upon kindly by her neighbors. Relations between settlers and the Cherokee had grown increasingly strained as more white families pushed westward. The Removal Act had been signed, though not yet fully implemented in these parts. Tensions simmered beneath a fragile peace, but such concerns seemed distant and unimportant as the child began to stir. His eyelids fluttered, then opened, revealing eyes dark as the river that had nearly claimed him. For a moment, he stared at Abigail without comprehension. Then fear flooded his face, and he tried to scramble away. "Easy," she said softly, keeping her distance. "You're safe. I pulled you from the river." The boy pressed himself against the stone hearth, eyes darting around the cabin. His gaze lingered on the door, measuring the distance. Abigail knew he was calculating his chances of escape. "You were under the ice," she continued, keeping her voice level. "You're in my home now. I won't hurt you." Whether he understood her words was unclear, but something in her tone seemed to reach him. The rigid tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Still, he watched her warily, like a young fox might watch a hunter who hadn't yet raised his rifle. "Are you hungry?" Abigail mimed eating. The boy's eyes flickered with interest despite his fear. She moved slowly to the small table where a loaf of bread sat beside a jar of preserved blackberries, summer captured in glass. She cut a thick slice, spread it with the dark preserve, and set it on a plate near the boy, then backed away. After a long moment of hesitation, hunger won out over caution. He snatched the bread and devoured it in quick, desperate bites. Abigail's heart twisted. How long had it been since he'd eaten properly? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "My name is Abigail," she said, touching her chest. Then she gestured toward him, raising her eyebrows in question. The boy swallowed his last bite of bread. He touched his own chest. "Adahi," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "Adahi," Abigail repeated, testing the unfamiliar syllables. The boy nodded once, a quick dip of his chin. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Snow began to fall again, thick flakes that quickly obscured the view from the windows. Abigail realized with a sinking feeling that the boy would not be leaving any time soon. Not in this weather, not in his weakened state. She would have to keep him here, at least until the storm passed. And she would have to keep him hidden. If Nathan Crawford, the settlement's self-appointed authority, learned she was harboring a Cherokee child. She pushed the thought away. One problem at a time. First, make sure the boy survived the night. "You should rest," she told Adahi, gesturing to the small cot in the corner where she slept. He shook his head vehemently, clearly unwilling to let down his guard so completely. "All right then," she conceded. By the fire, she brought out more blankets, arranging them into a pallet near the hearth. The boy watched her every move, still poised for flight, despite his exhaustion. Only when she retreated to her rocking chair on the opposite side of the room did he finally settle onto the makeshift bed, his back to the wall where he could see both her and the door. As darkness fell, Adahi's eyelids grew heavy despite his determination to remain vigilant. Eventually, his breathing deepened and slowed, his small body going limp with the profound sleep of the young and recently traumatized. Abigail remained in her chair, watching over him as the fire burned low. Outside, the storm raged on, erasing their tracks in the snow, sealing them together in this unexpected sanctuary. She wondered about the boy's family. Were they searching for him even now, battling through the blizzard? Or did they believe him already lost to the river's cold embrace? And what of his presence on settler land? Was it innocent wandering or something else? Questions without answers swirled in her mind as she drifted into an uneasy sleep, her last conscious thought a prayer that morning would bring clarity. She could not have known then that she had set in motion events that would echo far beyond her small cabin, or that 7 days later at dawn, she would stand on her porch facing 60 silent Cherokee hunters led by a man whose eyes matched Adahi's, in both color and determination. But that reckoning was still to come. For now, there was only the sound of the wind, the crackling fire, and two souls finding unexpected shelter in the heart of winter's fury. The next morning dawned clear and bitingly cold. Sunlight spilled through the frost-feathered windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. Abigail woke with a start, her neck stiff from sleeping upright. For a moment she was disoriented. Why was she in her chair rather than her bed? Then she remembered. The boy. Her gaze flew to the pallet by the hearth, but it was empty. The blankets pushed aside. A jolt of panic shot through her as she scanned the cabin. Had he fled in the night? But no. There he was, standing at her work table, small fingers tracing the outline of a half-finished carving. A fox, its tail curled around its body, waiting for her knife to free it from the wood. "Good morning," she said softly, so as not to startle him. Adahi turned, dropping his hand from the carving as if caught stealing. But there was less fear in his eyes today, replaced by the natural curiosity of childhood. He was wearing one of her old woolen shawls wrapped around his shoulders, his own clothes presumably still wet. "Are you hungry?" she asked, rising from the chair with a small groan as her muscles protested. The boy nodded, more decisive today. Progress. She busied herself preparing a simple breakfast. Cornmeal mush sweetened with honey, dried apples reconstituted in hot water, the last of yesterday's bread. As she worked, she sensed Adahi watching. Her, studying her movements with the intense focus children often bring to unfamiliar situations. When she set a steaming bowl before him, he hesitated only briefly before picking up the spoon. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by the occasional pop from the hearth and the distant cry of a crow outside. When Adahi had finished, he pushed his empty bowl away and looked directly at Abigail for the first time since awakening. "Thank you," he said in careful, accented English, touching his heart and then extending his hand toward her in a gesture that transcended language. Surprise rendered Abigail momentarily speechless. "You speak English," she finally managed, a small, cautious nod. "Some. My father. He says we must know the white man's tongue." "Your father is wise," Abigail replied, her mind racing with this new information. "Is he waiting for you? Will he be worried?" Adahi's face clouded. "He is hunting, with others, the big river." He made a sweeping gesture with his arm. "Many days." The big river would be the Mississippi, Abigail reasoned, far to the east. A hunting expedition, then. "And your mother?" The boy's expression closed like a door shutting. He looked away. "Gone, long sickness." "I'm sorry," Abigail said simply, recognizing the universal language of loss. "My husband is gone too." Adahi glanced around the cabin, perhaps noting for the first time the absence of a man's belongings. His gaze settled on a worn leather glove hanging by the door. Thomas's work glove that she couldn't bring herself to discard. "The river?" the boy said unexpectedly. "It took him?" "No," Abigail shook her head. "Fever. 2 winters past." Adahi considered this information with the solemn gravity children sometimes bring to matters of death. Then he touched his chest. "The cold water. You saved me from the long sleep." The way he phrased it, not as a question but as a realization, made Abigail's throat tighten with emotion. "Yes," she acknowledged, though anyone would have done the same. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Not everyone would have risked the treacherous ice for a Cherokee child. Some in Willow Creek would have seen it as providence rather than tragedy, one less Indian to worry about. The thought chilled her more than the winter air. "Why were you crossing the river?" she asked, trying to keep her tone conversational. "It's dangerous, especially alone." Adahi's eyes dropped to the table. "Hunting," he mumbled, "for my father, to show I can." To prove himself, then. Abigail understood the impulse well enough. How many times had she pushed herself beyond prudence after Thomas died, determined to show the settlement and herself that she could survive, alone. "It was brave," she allowed, "but also foolish. The ice is never safe this time of year, especially near the bend where the current runs strong." The boy nodded, properly chastened, but with a flicker of defiance that reminded Abigail he was still a child testing boundaries, regardless of his heritage. "Your clothes should be dry soon," she said, changing the subject, "but the storm has left deep snow. You'll need to stay until paths are clear." Adahi tensed. "I must return. My people will search." "Not in this," Abigail gestured to the window, where drifts had piled halfway up the glass. "And not until you're stronger. The river took much of your strength." As if to confirm her words, the boy swayed slightly where he sat, fatigue evident in the shadows beneath his eyes. His ordeal had extracted a greater toll than his pride wanted to admit. "Rest today," she insisted gently. "Tomorrow we will see." To her surprise, Adahi nodded, accepting her judgment without further argument. Perhaps he recognized the wisdom in her words, or perhaps he simply lacked the energy to resist. Either way, he allowed Abigail to settle him back on the pallet with fresh blankets, his eyelids already growing heavy as his body demanded the rest it needed to heal. While he slept, Abigail attended to her daily chores, stoking the fire, melting snow for water, checking her stores of food. The storm had left them well isolated, which was both blessing and curse. No one from the settlement would be calling, which meant the boy remained undiscovered, but it also meant she couldn't seek help or counsel. Not that there was anyone in Willow Creek she could safely tell about Adahi. Relations with the Cherokee had deteriorated over the past year as pressure mounted for them to cede more territory and move west. The Federal Removal Act had emboldened settlers like Nathan Crawford, who spoke openly of claiming Cherokee land once the savages are dealt with. Even kindly souls like Martha Parker, the miller's wife, averted their eyes when such talk arose, unwilling to challenge the growing sentiment. As afternoon waned toward evening, Abigail found herself standing at her workbench, knife in hand, the half-carved fox forgotten as she began a new piece. From a small block of pine, a form gradually emerged, a river otter, sleek and playful, its head raised as if scenting the air. She wasn't sure why this creature came to her fingers today, only that it felt right. A small sound made her turn. Adahi stood watching her, blanket still wrapped around his shoulders, his dark eyes intent on the emerging carving. "You make spirit animals," he said, not a question, but a statement of recognition. Abigail looked down at the otter taking shape beneath her hands. "Is that what they are?" The boy nodded solemnly. "Each one has power, different medicine." He pointed to the nearly finished fox on the shelf. "Fox is clever, teaches wisdom in difficult times." His finger moved to a small carved owl. Owl sees in darkness, knows things others cannot. "And the otter?" Abigail asked, genuinely curious. Thomas had taught her carving as a practical skill, a way to while away winter evenings and perhaps earn a few coins at the spring fair. He had never spoken of spirit animals or medicine. Adahi smiled for the first time, a small, shy curving of lips that transformed his face. "Otter plays between worlds, water and land, life and death, brings joy even in cold seasons." Something about his explanation resonated deep within Abigail, as if he had articulated a truth she had always known but never named. She held out the half-finished carving. "Would you like to try?" The boy's eyes widened with surprise and something like longing. He hesitated, then stepped forward, accepting the small knife she offered. His hands were surprisingly steady as he made his first careful cut, removing a sliver of wood to define the otter's tail. "My father carves," he said quietly, focused on his work. "Teaches me when there is time." "You have a good eye," Abigail observed, watching his confident movements. "It's a rare gift." They worked together as afternoon faded into evening, the boy learning the feel of her tools, Abigail guiding when needed, but mostly letting him find his own way. In this shared activity, the invisible barrier between them, Cherokee and settler, child and adult, male and female, seemed to thin and blur. They were simply two people engaged in bringing form from formlessness, finding meaning in wood and blade and patient hands. As darkness fell, Abigail prepared a simple supper: bean soup with the last of her salt pork, corn cakes fried crisp. In the rendered fat, Adahi ate with healthy appetite, a good sign his strength was returning. After the meal, as they sat before the fire, he unexpectedly spoke. "The river took me to you," he said, his voice thoughtful in the firelight. "The spirits have purpose." Abigail wasn't sure how to respond. Her own faith, shaped by her grandmother's quaint mixture of biblical teaching and woodland wisdom, had little room for spirits with purpose. Yet something in the boy's words rang true. There had been a pattern to their meeting that felt more than chance. "Perhaps," she acknowledged, neither confirming nor denying. "What matters is that you're safe now." Adahi nodded, but his expression remained serious. "My father will come," he stated with absolute certainty. "He will find me." When the snow melts, we'll find a way to let him know where you are, Abigail promised, though she had no idea how she would accomplish this without putting either of them at risk. The boy shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. He will know, already. Something in his tone sent a shiver down Abigail's spine, though not entirely of fear. There was comfort in his confidence, in his absolute faith that he was not forgotten, that someone was searching. How different from her own silent grief after Thomas, when she had felt utterly abandoned by both God and man. Later, as Adai slept peacefully by the hearth, Abigail stood at the window, gazing out at the moonlit snow. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine white blanket across the landscape, beautiful and treacherous, like so much in this untamed country. Somewhere beyond that glittering expanse, a Cherokee father hunted, unaware that his son had nearly joined the ancestors. Or was he aware somehow, as Adahi seemed to believe? Abigail pressed her palm against the cold glass, her breath fogging, the pain. For the first time in a very long while, she whispered a genuine prayer, not the rote phrases she muttered each Sunday out of habit, but words that welled from somewhere deeper. "Guide us both through this," she murmured to whatever might be listening. "Let no harm come from this crossing of paths." And as if in answer, a night bird called from the darkness, its voice clear and piercing in the winter stillness. Abigail didn't know what kind of bird it was or what its call might portend. But in that moment, it felt like enough simply to be heard. Days passed like water flowing beneath ice, silent, steady, invisible to those who didn't know to look. 3 suns had risen and fallen since Abigail pulled Adahi from the frozen river. The snow remained deep across the valley, transforming the familiar landscape into something otherworldly. Paths that once connected the scattered homesteads of Willow Creek now lay buried beneath pristine drifts, isolating each household in its own island of lamplight and wood smoke. For Abigail and Adahi, this isolation became a sanctuary of sorts. Within the walls of her small cabin, they established a rhythm that transcended the boundaries of language and custom. Each morning, Abigail woke first, stoking the banked embers of the hearth into renewed flame before putting water on to boil. Adahi would stir soon after, rising from his pallet with the silent grace that seemed inherent to his people, helping. Without being asked to fold his bedding and set it aside, they shared breakfast in companionable silence, the boy's appetite growing stronger each day, a sure sign his body was healing from its brush with death. Afterward, Abigail would see to her necessary chores, melting snow for water, tending to marmalade and the 3 chickens that sheltered in the lean-to behind the cabin, checking her dwindling stores of food. Adahi watched her movements with careful attention, then began to mimic them, fetching kindling for the fire, feeding corn to the chickens, even attempting to help her mend a torn sleeve, though his stitches were clumsy and uneven. "My father says a man must know all tasks," he explained when she found him struggling with the needle. "Hunt, fight, cook, sew, all are needed for life." Abigail nodded, remembering how Thomas had been equally versatile, as most frontier men had to be. "Your father is right," she said, gently correcting his awkward stitches. "On the frontier, those who can do only one thing rarely survive." "Frontier," Adahi repeated, testing the unfamiliar word. "This is edge place." "Yes," Abigail smiled at his apt description. "The edge between wilderness and civilization, some would say." The boy considered this, his dark eyes thoughtful. "My people do not see edges," he said finally. "All is one place, all connected." There was something profound in his simple statement that made Abigail pause in her sewing. How different might relations between their peoples be if more settlers embraced such a view? If land was seen not as property to be claimed, but as a living entity that connected all who dwelled upon it. These moments of unexpected wisdom from the child occurred with increasing frequency as his comfort with her, and with English, grew. Though still reserved, he no longer started at sudden sounds or watched her from the corners of his eyes. His gaze was direct now, curious, sometimes even playful. On the fourth day, when the clouds finally parted to reveal a brilliant blue sky, Adahi stood at the window watching as sunlight transformed the snow-covered valley into a sea of blinding white. "We could walk today," he suggested, turning to Abigail with barely contained eagerness. "The snow has—" He made a gesture with his hands, patting something down. "Settled," Abigail supplied. "And yes, perhaps we could venture a short distance." The idea of fresh air and open sky appealed to her as well. The cabin, spacious enough for one, had begun to feel confining with two occupants. She bundled Adahi in a spare wool coat that had belonged to Thomas years ago, rolling up the sleeves, until his hands emerged. The garment hung to his knees, giving him a comical appearance that drew a rare giggle from the boy when he caught sight of himself in the small mirror above the wash basin. Abigail found herself laughing too, the sound unfamiliar in her throat after so many months of solitude. They stepped outside into a world transformed by winter's artistry. Every branch bore the weight of snow. Every surface reflected the brilliant sunlight. Their breath formed clouds before their faces as they made their way carefully around the cabin. Adahi's energy seemed boundless now that he was free from confinement. He ran ahead, then circled back, pointing out animal tracks in the snow, rabbit, fox, the delicate impressions of bird feet. "You know much about tracking," Abigail observed as he knelt to examine a set of tiny parallel lines where a field mouse had scurried across the surface. "My uncle teaches me," Adahi replied, gently brushing snow aside to reveal more of the trail. "He is best hunter in our band. Can find deer 3 days old through forest. And will you be a hunter too when you're grown?" The boy stood, brushing snow from his borrowed mittens. "I will be many things," he said with the simple certainty of youth. "Hunter, carver, maybe healer like my grandmother." They continued their exploration, keeping to the ridge above the river, where the wind had swept the snow into manageable drifts. Adahi insisted on walking in front, testing each step before allowing Abigail to follow, a reversal of roles that touched her deeply. This child, not even a decade old, already embodied the protective instinct of his people. Near a stand of bare-limbed ash trees, Adahi suddenly stopped, crouching low. "Look," he whispered, pointing. At first, Abigail saw nothing. Then a movement caught her eye. A magnificent red-tailed hawk perched on a branch, its feathers puffed against the cold, eyes alert as it surveyed the snow below for any sign of prey. "Tsiskwa," Adahi breathed, using the Cherokee word. "He watches over warriors." They stood motionless, observing the raptor until it spread its wings and launched into flight, circling once above their heads before soaring toward the distant mountains. Adahi's face shone with delight and something more, a kind of reverence that Abigail recognized from her own childhood encounters with the wild. Before grief had dulled her sense of wonder, before survival had narrowed her focus to the practical. "Your people see messages in such things?" she asked as they resumed walking. Adahi nodded solemnly. "All creatures speak if you know how to listen. Hawk says, 'Be watchful, see far.'" "And what does river say?" The question slipped out before Abigail could consider its wisdom. The boy had nearly drowned. Perhaps it was cruel to remind him. But Adahi showed no distress. "River speaks of journey," he said simply, "always moving, always changing, but always itself." He looked up at her, squinting against the sun. "River took me to you. Now we share path." The statement, delivered with Such matter-of-fact certainty left Abigail momentarily wordless. This child saw patterns and connections where she had long seen only random chance or, at best, divine punishment. What would it be like to view the world through such eyes? To see purpose in suffering, message in nature, connection in all things? They returned to the cabin as the sun began its descent, cheeks flushed with cold and exertion. Abigail prepared a simple meal of cornbread and beans, supplemented with the last of her preserved venison. As they ate, she noticed Adahi watching her with particular intensity. "What is it?" she asked gently. "You're studying me like one of your tracks in the snow." The boy set down his spoon. "You have no children," he said. Not a question, but an observation. Abigail felt a familiar ache behind her ribs. "No," she answered. "Thomas and I... It wasn't granted to us. But you know how to care for a child. I helped raise my sister's children for a time before they moved west to Oregon Territory." She smiled faintly at the memory of little James and Mary, with their matching auburn curls and gap-toothed grins. "And I've delivered many babies as midwife for the settlement." Adahi nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation. After a moment, he spoke again. "My mother died when snow last melted. Spring flowers were just opening." The simple statement, delivered without visible emotion, struck Abigail like a physical blow. No wonder the boy had seemed so self-contained, so adult in his manner. Recent grief had shaped him, just as it had shaped her. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "It's a hard thing to lose a mother." "Father says she walks with ancestors now." Adahi continued, eyes on his plate. "Says she watches over me still." He looked up suddenly, gaze direct and searching. "Do you believe this?" The question caught Abigail off guard. Her own beliefs had become muddled in the years since Thomas's death, her childhood faith eroded by unanswered prayers and seemingly senseless suffering. Yet looking into Adahi's earnest face, she couldn't bring herself to voice her doubts. "I believe those we love remain with us somehow," she said carefully. "In our memories, in our hearts, perhaps in ways we can't fully understand." The boy considered this, head tilted slightly as if listening to some inner voice. "Yes," he said finally, "this is true. But sometimes they also send Hawk to watch over us." Abigail smiled despite herself. "Perhaps they do." That night, after Adahi had fallen asleep by the hearth, Abigail sat at her workbench, carving by the light of a single candle. Her hands moved almost of their own accord, shaping the wood according to some design her conscious mind had not yet recognized. Gradually a form emerged, not the otter she had begun days ago, but a hawk in flight, wings outstretched, head alert and watchful. She worked until her eyes grew heavy, then placed the nearly finished carving on the mantel above. The sleeping boy, a guardian of sorts, she thought, though whether for him or for herself, she couldn't quite say. The next morning brought a change in the weather. Grey clouds gathered on the western horizon, and the air carried the particular stillness that often precedes snow. Abigail knew they might have only hours before another storm arrived, perhaps burying them for days more. She needed to replenish their dwindling supplies. Flour, salt, perhaps a bit of sugar if she could trade for it. "I must go to the settlement today," she told Adahi as they broke their fast. "We need provisions." Alarm flashed across the boy's face. "I will come with you." Abigail shook her head firmly. "No, it isn't safe. There are those in Willow Creek who..." She hesitated, unwilling to frighten him unnecessarily. "Who might not understand why you're here." "Because I am Cherokee," Adahi said, his voice flat with a knowledge beyond his years. "Yes," Abigail acknowledged, seeing no point in protecting him from a truth he already understood. "There has been trouble between our peoples. Some settlers blame all Cherokee for the actions of a few. It isn't right, but it is the way things are. The boy's expression turned inward, considering. They would harm me. I don't know, Abigail answered honestly, but I won't risk it. You must stay here, keep the door barred, and remain quiet. I'll return before midday. Adahi looked as if he might protest further, but instead gave a single nod of acceptance. I will tend the fire and feed marmalade, he said with a dignity that belied his small stature, and watch for your return. Abigail prepared quickly, donning her heaviest cloak and sturdiest boots. She tucked 2 carved foxes into her basket, pieces to trade at Martha Parker's store for the goods they needed. Before leaving, she knelt to Adahi's level, looking directly into his solemn eyes. Promise me you'll stay inside, she insisted, no matter what. I promise, he replied, then added unexpectedly, be watchful, like hawk. The path to Willow Creek took longer to navigate than usual, the snow having obscured familiar landmarks. By the time Abigail reached the small cluster of buildings that formed the settlement center, the western sky had darkened ominously. She hurried toward the general store, hoping to complete her business and be on her way before the storm broke. The bell above the door jangled as she entered. Martha Parker looked up from behind the counter, her plump face registering surprise. Abigail Harlow, she exclaimed. We'd begun to wonder if you'd been buried alive up there on your ridge. It's been, a week since anyone's laid eyes on you? The snow was too deep to manage the path, Abigail explained, stomping her boots on the threshold. But we're running low on essentials, and with another storm coming. Smart of you. To come today, Martha nodded. My William says this one will be worse than the last. 3 days of it, he's predicting. She began gathering items as Abigail listed them: flour, salt, coffee beans, a precious twist of sugar wrapped in brown paper. How are you managing up there alone? That cabin must feel mighty empty with just yourself. Abigail evaded the question, focusing instead on unwrapping her carvings. I have these to trade, she said, placing the foxes on the counter. Thomas always said your youngest had a fondness for woodland creatures. Martha's eyes softened at the sight of the delicately carved animals. That she does, and these are finer than any I've seen. You've a gift, Abigail. She looked up, expression suddenly earnest. You know, there's talk of Nathan Crawford calling on you come spring. He's been widowed 3 years now, and his children need a mother's hand. The suggestion sent a chill through Abigail, unrelated to the winter air. Nathan Crawford was everything she found distasteful in a man: arrogant, unyielding, prone to speaking with absolute certainty on matters he barely understood. The thought of becoming his wife, of submitting to his authority in his bed, was profoundly unsettling. I've no interest in remarrying, she said stiffly. I manage well enough on my own. Martha sighed, clearly having anticipated this response. Pride won't keep you warm, Abigail. And that ridge of yours is no place for a woman alone, especially with all this trouble brewing. Trouble? Abigail's pulse quickened. What trouble? The Cherokee, of course. Martha lowered her voice, though they were the only ones in the store. There's been a band of them moving through the territory, armed to the teeth from what I hear. William says they're looking for something or someone. Scouting parties have been seen as close as Miller's Creek. Abigail struggled to keep her expression neutral as her mind raced. Could they be searching for Adahi? But how would they know to look in this direction? Has there been any violence? She asked carefully. Martha shook her head. Not yet, praise be. But Nathan's organized a militia of sorts. They're patrolling the outlying areas, making their presence known. She leaned closer, eyes wide. They say the Cherokee numbered 60 at least, all warriors, all armed, if they've hostile intentions. Abigail gathered her purchases with hands she forced to remain steady. I'm sure it's nothing to worry over, she said, striving for a casual tone. The Cherokee have kept to the treaty these past years. No reason to think they'd violate it now. Martha snorted, clearly unconvinced. Treaties mean little to savages. You'd do well to keep your rifle loaded, living out there alone as you do. The conversation left Abigail deeply unsettled as she made her way back up the path. Toward home, she found herself scanning the tree line, searching for any sign of movement among the bare branches. Not out of fear of Cherokee warriors, but fear for them. If Nathan Crawford and his self-appointed militia encountered Adahi's people. The first flakes of snow began to fall as she crested the final rise. The cabin came into view, smoke rising steadily from the chimney, a sight that would normally bring comfort but now filled her with apprehension. She had left a Cherokee child alone in her home while armed settlers patrolled the countryside. What had she been thinking? She quickened her pace, nearly slipping on the increasingly treacherous path. As she approached the cabin, the door suddenly flew open. Adahi stood on the threshold, small face tight with anxiety that melted into relief. At the sight of her, "You return," he said simply, stepping aside to let her enter. "Of course I return," she replied, setting down her basket and shrugging off her snow-dusted cloak. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Adahi closed the door, securing the wooden bar across it with practiced movements. "Storm comes," he said, nodding, toward the window where snowflakes now fell thick and fast. "Sometimes people are lost in white." Something in his tone made Abigail wonder if he spoke from experience. If perhaps his own mother had ventured out on some errand and never returned. But she didn't press. The boy was entitled to his privacy, his grief. "I'm not so easily lost," she assured him instead, unpacking her purchases. "And look, I've brought sugar. We can make maple candy if the storm keeps us housebound." The boy's face brightened at this prospect, momentarily banishing the shadow of worry. They spent the afternoon preparing for the coming days of isolation, banking the fire to burn slowly, setting pots to catch snow that could be melted for water, checking the stores of firewood stacked beside the hearth. Through it all, Abigail debated whether to tell Adahi what she had learned in the settlement. Would it bring him comfort to know his people might be searching for him, or would it only increase his anxiety, knowing they might encounter hostile settlers in their quest? As twilight descended, bringing with it the full force of the storm, Abigail made her decision. They sat before the fire, sipping tea sweetened with precious sugar when she spoke. "There's something you should know," she began, choosing her words carefully. "In the settlement today, I heard talk of Cherokee warriors moving through the territory." Adahi's head snapped up, tea forgotten. "My father," he said with absolute certainty. "He comes for me." "Possibly," Abigail acknowledged. "The settlers believe they're searching for something, or someone. But Adahi, the settlers are also mobilizing. Armed men patrol the woods. If your father and his band encounter them..." She let the implication hang in the air between them. The boy's face turned thoughtful, not frightened as she had feared. "My father is wise," he said after a moment. "He knows the ways of white men. He will not seek war." A pause, then with quiet pride. "He is peace chief." This revelation gave Abigail pause. A peace chief would indeed approach with caution, would understand the delicate balance required when entering settler territory. But would Nathan Crawford and his militia recognize such distinctions? Or would they see only what they expected to see, savage warriors threatening their claim to the land? "Tell me about your father," she requested, hoping to better understand the man she might soon face. "What kind of chief is he?" Ada's expression softened with obvious affection. "He is Inola, Black Fox in your tongue, strong but gentle, speaks with settlers in their own words, knows many languages." The boy traced a pattern on the wooden floor beside him. "He says understanding comes before peace, must know enemies, heart to make him friend." "And has he made many friends among the settlers?" Abigail asked. "Some," Adahi nodded. "Traders who come to our village. The man called Reverend who speaks of your God, the doctor who helped when spotted sickness came." His voice dropped. "Not enough friends to stop the paper that says we must leave our land." The Removal Act. Abigail felt a pang of shame, though. She had played no part in its creation or enforcement. Still, it had been men who looked like her, who spoke her language and worshipped her God, who had decided that the Cherokee and other tribes must abandon their ancestral homelands to make way for white settlement. "I'm sorry," she said, the words wholly inadequate, but all she had to offer. Ade looked at her with eyes older than his years. "You did not make the paper," he said, echoing her earlier thoughts. "And you pulled me from river when others might have turned away." He smiled then, a genuine brightening that reminded her of his youth despite his solemn demeanor. "My father will thank you." Abigail returned his smile, though inside she felt less certain. Would a Cherokee peace chief truly thank a white woman for harboring his son? Or would he see only another settler encroaching on what remained of his people's world? The storm howled around the cabin, wind finding every crack and crevice, making the flames in the hearth dance and flicker. Abigail added another log to the fire, watching as sparks spiraled up the chimney like stars seeking their place in the night sky. "Whatever comes," she said quietly, "know that I'm glad the river brought you here." Adahi nodded solemnly. "The water knows its path," he replied. "Like hawk knows the wind." They sat in companionable silence as the fire crackled and the snow continued to fall, each lost in thoughts of what the coming days might bring. Outside, the world disappeared beneath a blanket of white. Inside, an unlikely bond continued to strengthen, a bridge forming between two worlds that had long regarded each other with suspicion and fear. The storm raged for 2 days, confining them to the cabin's single room. They passed the time with small tasks and quiet conversations. Abigail taught Adai to read simple words from her treasured Bible, the only book she owned. In turn, he showed her how to weave a small basket from strips of bark she had collected the previous summer, his small fingers deft and sure as they worked the material into intricate patterns. "My grandmother weaves finest baskets in village," he explained as he guided her hands through a particularly complex turn, so tight they hold water without leaking. "And did she teach you this skill?" Abigail asked, struggling to maintain the tension in her weaving. Adahi nodded. "She says men must know women's work too. Balance in all things." He adjusted her grip slightly. "There, now you see?" On the third morning, they woke to silence. The wind had died overnight, leaving a world transformed in its wake. Sunlight poured through the frost-rimed windows, reflecting off the snow with blinding intensity. Abigail opened the door cautiously, finding drifts nearly to her waist on the eastern side of the cabin, where the wind had piled the snow against the wall. "We'll need to dig out," she said, reaching for the wooden shovel Thomas had carved years ago, "at least clear a path to the woodpile." Adahi insisted on helping despite his size, using a pan from the kitchen to scoop snow while Abigail tackled the deeper drifts. They worked steadily, the exertion warming them despite the biting cold. When they had cleared the immediate area around the cabin, Abigail paused, leaning on her shovel to catch her breath. The valley below lay pristine and unbroken, a white canvas stretching to the horizon. "Beautiful," she murmured, momentarily overcome by the sheer splendor of the winter landscape. "Yes," Adahi agreed, standing beside her. Then, unexpectedly, but dangerous too, beauty and danger often walk together. Abigail glanced down at him, struck once again by the wisdom that sometimes emerged from this child. "You're right," she acknowledged. "Like many things in this world, They were about to return inside when Adahi suddenly stiffened, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. "Look," he said, pointing toward the frozen river far below. At first, Abigail saw nothing. Then movement caught her eye, a flash of dark against the white. A lone figure making its way along the river's edge, moving with the careful deliberation of one navigating unfamiliar territory. "Is it?" she began, but Adahi was already shaking his head. "Not my father," he said, disappointment evident in his voice. "Wrong shape, too small." As they watched, the figure stopped, seeming to examine something on the ground. Even from this distance, Abigail could see it was a man, heavily bundled against the cold. Something about his movements struck her as familiar. "It's William Parker," she realized aloud. "Martha's husband. What is he doing so far from the settlement?" Adahi's expression turned wary. "Looking for tracks," he said with quiet certainty. "Your people fear mine are coming." Abigail felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. If William was searching the riverbank, it meant Nathan Crawford's militia was expanding its patrol. How long before they ventured up to her isolated cabin? "Inside," she said firmly, ushering the boy back through the door. "We must be careful now." Throughout the day, Abigail found herself returning to the window, watching as William Parker continued his methodical examination of the riverbank. By mid-afternoon, he had been joined by two other men. They conversed briefly, then split up, one continuing along the river while the others began to ascend the ridge in the direction of her cabin. "They come," Adahi said from beside her, his voice calm despite the tension evident in his small frame. Abigail made a quick decision. "To the root cellar," she instructed, lifting the trapdoor concealed beneath a small rug. Quickly now. The boy descended without protest into the dark space beneath the cabin floor. Abigail handed down a blanket and a small lantern. "Stay quiet," she whispered. "No matter what you hear, I'll come for you when it's safe." Adahi nodded, eyes wide but trusting in the lantern light. "Be careful," he said. "They fear what they do not understand." Abigail lowered the trapdoor, arranging the rug to conceal it once more. She had barely finished when a knock sounded at the door, firm, authoritative. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she opened it to find William Parker and Silas Jenkins, the blacksmith's son, standing on her threshold. "Afternoon, Abigail," William greeted her, removing his hat. "Hope we're not disturbing you." "Not at all," she replied, forcing a smile. "Though I wasn't expecting visitors after such a storm. You must be half frozen from your trek. Come in, warm yourselves." The men entered, stamping snow from their boots. Silas, a taciturn young man barely out of his teens, nodded awkwardly in greeting. Both carried rifles slung across their backs. Not unusual for men traveling through wilderness in winter, but the sight nonetheless heightened Abigail's anxiety. "Martha mentioned you'd visited just before the snow flew," William said, accepting. The cup of hot tea she offered. "Said you seemed well enough, considering your isolation." "I manage," Abigail replied evenly. "What brings you gentlemen so far from the settlement? Surely not concern for my welfare alone." William and Silas exchanged glances. "There's been sign of Cherokee in the area," William explained, his tone carefully neutral. "Nathan's organized patrols to keep watch. Thought we should check the outlying homesteads, make sure all's well." "Very thoughtful," Abigail commented, struggling to keep the irony from her voice. "But as you can see, I've had no visitors save yourselves." Silas, who had been surveying the cabin with poorly concealed curiosity, suddenly frowned. "What's this?" he asked, picking up the small leather pouch Adahi had worn around his neck when Abigail pulled him from the river. In her haste to hide the boy, she had forgotten to conceal it as well. William's eyes narrowed. "That looks like Indian work," he observed, turning to Abigail with sudden suspicion. Care to explain? Abigail's mind raced as Silas Jenkins held Adahy's medicine pouch between thick, calloused fingers. William Parker's eyes had narrowed to suspicious slits, his earlier friendliness evaporating like morning mist under a harsh sun. The cabin suddenly felt too small, the air too thick with unspoken accusations. "It's a curiosity," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "I found it last autumn while gathering herbs by the river. Thought it might make an interesting pattern for my own craft work." She reached for the pouch with deliberate casualness. "The beadwork is quite intricate, don't you think?" Silas relinquished it reluctantly, clearly unconvinced. "Looks fresh," he muttered. "Not something that's been lying in the elements for months." "I keep it wrapped in oilcloth," Abigail countered, tucking the pouch into her apron pocket. "Now, is there something specific I can help you gentlemen with? I was about to begin my evening chores." William's gaze swept the cabin once more, lingering on the 2 cups that remained on the table from when she and Adahy had taken tea earlier. She should have cleared them away, a careless mistake that might cost them dearly. "Been entertaining company, Abigail?" William asked, his tone deceptively light. She didn't blink. "I often set 2 places," she replied. "Old habits are hard to break when you've been married as long as I was." The explanation seemed to satisfy William, whose expression softened slightly with pity, a reaction Abigail would normally resent, but now welcomed if it diverted suspicion. Silas, however, continued to scowl, his young face hardened by prejudice. "Older than himself. We should check the outbuildings," he suggested to William. "Make sure nothing's been disturbed." Abigail's heart stuttered. The root cellar's entrance was outside as well as inside, a second door half hidden behind the lean-to where she kept winter vegetables. If they searched thoroughly. "There's only the chicken coop and storage shed," she said quickly. "And they're snowed in still. I haven't managed to clear paths to them yet." "Udesh, we can manage snow," Silas insisted, already moving toward the door. William hesitated, then nodded. "Standard procedure, Abigail, just being thorough, you understand." She forced a tight smile. "Of course, though you'll forgive me if I stay. By the fire. My old bones aren't as fond of cold as they once were." The men stepped outside, leaving the door ajar. Abigail moved to the window, watching as they made their way around the side of the cabin, breaking a path through knee-deep snow. She glanced anxiously at the trapdoor where Adahy hid. Had she been clear enough about the need for absolute silence? Would the boy understand to remain hidden, even if he heard strange voices outside the second entrance to his sanctuary? Minutes stretched like hours as Abigail strained to hear any sound that might indicate discovery. The fire popped loudly, making her start. Marmalade jumped onto the table, tail twitching as he sensed her tension. Finally, the crunch of snow announced the men's return. "Satisfied?" she asked as they stomped their boots on the threshold. "Seems in order," William conceded. "Though we didn't check inside the storage shed. Lock was frozen solid." Relief washed through her. The second entrance to the root cellar was inside that shed, hidden behind stacked crates. "As I said, I haven't been out there since the storm." Silas still looked unconvinced, but William was clearly ready to move on. "We should head back before dark," he said, reaching for his hat. "Nathan wants reports by evening." "Nathan Crawford seems to be taking charge of many things lately," Abigail observed, unable to entirely keep the edge from her voice. William's expression turned serious. "These are uncertain times, Abigail. The Cherokee have grown bold since the government delayed removal. Some say they're gathering forces, preparing to resist when the soldiers come to escort them west." He adjusted his rifle strap. "Nathan's just looking out for the settlement's safety." "And does this looking out include confronting any Cherokee found on this side of the river?" she asked carefully. "Depends on their intentions," William replied. "Peaceful traders are one thing, armed bands are another." And who determines their intentions? Abigail pressed. Who speaks their language well enough to ask? William frowned slightly. That's not the point. Treaty says they stay on their side. That's clear enough in any language. She knew better than to argue further. The minds of men like William Parker were not easily changed, especially when fear had taken root. Instead, she walked them to the door, thanking them for their concern and assuring them she would sound the settlement's bell if she spotted anything unusual. You really should consider Nathan's offer come spring, William said as he stepped outside. A woman alone up. Here, Dune is not natural, not safe. I'll keep it in mind, Abigail lied. Safe journey back to town. She watched until the men disappeared over the ridge, then waited several minutes more to ensure they weren't doubling back. Only when she was certain they were truly gone did she lift the trapdoor. Adahi, she whispered into the darkness below. It's safe now. The boy emerged like a shadow, his movements fluid and silent. His face showed no fear, only calm assessment of the situation. They search for my people, he stated rather than asked. Yes, Abigail confirmed, securing the door. There's a militia forming in the settlement. They're patrolling the area, watching for any sign of Cherokee crossing the river. Adahi nodded, as if this news was expected. The men who came. They suspect. They found your medicine pouch, Abigail admitted. I told them it was something I found by the river months ago. Did they believe? She hesitated. William seemed to. The younger one, Silas, is less easily convinced, but they've gone for now. Adahi retrieved his pouch from her apron pocket, cradling it in his palms with obvious relief. My grandmother made this when I was born, he explained. It holds I don't know the word, small pieces of important things. A talisman, Abigail suggested, or perhaps a charm for protection. Yes, the boy nodded. Protection, connection to ancestors. I should not have left it where others could find. My fault as much as yours, Abigail sighed, sinking into her rocking chair. I should have been more careful. Now they'll be watching the cabin. Adahi stood before her, suddenly looking very much the child he was, despite his usual composure. I bring danger to you, he said softly. Perhaps I should go when darkness comes, find my father's hunting party. The thought sent a bolt of fear through Abigail's heart. Absolutely not, she said firmly. The wilderness is treacherous enough in summer. In winter, with armed men patrolling, it would be suicide. But if they return, they won't find you. We'll be more careful now. She rose, placing her hands on his thin shoulders. I pulled you from that river for a reason, Adahi. I won't abandon you now. The boy studied her face, searching for something, reassurance perhaps, or confirmation of her resolve. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him. Then we make new plan, he said, with the pragmatism of one accustomed to adjusting to difficult circumstances. Together, they prepared for the possibility of further intrusions. Adahi's bedding was stored beneath Abigail's mattress during the day. His few possessions were hidden in a cavity behind a loose stone in the hearth. They established signals. 3 soft taps on the floor meant danger, retreat to the root cellar. They practiced until the boy could disappear from sight within seconds, leaving no trace of his presence. As darkness fell, they sat by the fire, the tension of the afternoon's close call gradually easing from their bodies. Abigail found herself studying the medicine pouch that had nearly betrayed them. May I ask what's inside? She inquired, then quickly added, if it's not too personal a question. Adahi considered for a moment, then carefully untied the leather thong that secured the pouch. From within, he withdrew several small objects, arranging them on his palm so she could see: a tiny carved wooden bear, a glossy black feather, a smooth river stone with a natural hole through its center, and what appeared to be a small tuft of dark hair bound with sinew. Beartooth protects from harm, he explained, pointing to each item in turn. Raven feather brings wisdom. Stone with eye sees what is hidden. And this, he indicated the bound hair, is from my mother's head, so she walks with me always. Abigail was touched by the reverence with which he handled these simple treasures. In her world, worth was measured in practical terms: coin, livestock, productive land. Yet, here was wealth of a different sort, carried close to the heart, connecting this child to his heritage and loved ones regardless of physical distance. They're beautiful, she said honestly, and clearly very powerful. They kept you alive in the river until I found you. Adahi nodded solemnly as he returned the items to their pouch. Some power comes from believing, he said with that disarming wisdom that occasionally emerged from him, like your book. He gestured toward the Bible on Abigail's small shelf. Yes, she agreed, somewhat surprised by the apt comparison. Faith gives ordinary things extraordinary meaning. They retired early that night, both drained from the day's events. As Abigail drifted toward sleep, she found herself wondering about Adai's father, the peace chief searching for his son. What kind of man commanded the respect of 60 warriors, yet still sought diplomacy over conflict? Would he understand that she meant his child no harm? Or would he see only another white settler, indistinguishable from those who threatened his people's way of life? Morning brought heavy clouds and a sharp drop in temperature. The world outside the cabin windows appeared frozen in suspended animation. No birds sang, no branches swayed, even the smoke from the chimney rose in a perfect vertical column before dissipating into the grey sky. It was the kind of cold that made every living thing hold its breath, waiting for release. Abigail checked their stores while Adahi tended the fire. They had enough food for perhaps a week if they were careful. After that, she would need to venture to the settlement again, a prospect that now filled her with apprehension. Would William Parker have spread word of his suspicions? Would others come to investigate? "Storm coming," Adahi announced, his face pressed to the frosted window. "Big one? How can you tell?" Abigail asked, joining him. The sky looked threatening, certainly, but no more so than the day before. "Birds gone," the boy pointed out. "Air smells different. And this?" He traced a pattern in the frost on the glass, intricate crystalline structures that Abigail had never paid particular attention to. Winter spirits preparing. Whether his prediction was based on keen observation of natural signs or simply childhood fancy, Abigail couldn't say. But by midday, the first flakes began to fall. Not the gentle floating crystals of a typical snowfall, but tiny hard pellets that rattled against the window panes like thrown sand. Within hours, the wind had risen to a howl, driving snow horizontally across the landscape, obliterating visibility beyond a few yards. "You were right," Abigail conceded as they huddled by the fire, listening to the storm's fury. "How did you learn to read weather signs so young?" "All Cherokee children learn," Adahi replied, his hands busy with a piece of wood Abigail had given him to carve. "Weather is life, must understand to survive." The storm raged through the night and into the following day, confining them to the cabin's single room. They passed the time with small tasks. Abigail mending clothes that had long needed attention, Adahi continuing to work on his carving, which was gradually taking the shape of a small turtle. The enforced isolation should have felt claustrophobic, yet Abigail found unexpected comfort in the companionable quiet they shared. By the third day, the storm had blown itself out, leaving behind a transformed landscape. Drifts rose to the cabin windows in places, and the path William and Silas had broken to the outbuildings had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. The world had been wiped clean, offered a fresh beginning. Or so it seemed, until mid-morning, when Adahi, gazing out the window, suddenly stiffened. "Someone comes," he said, voice tight with apprehension. Abigail joined him at the window, squinting against the glare of sun on snow. At first, she saw nothing. Then movement caught her eye. A figure trudging up the path from the direction of the settlement, breaking trail through waist-high drifts, with obvious effort. "It's Nathan Crawford," she said, recognizing the settlement's self-appointed leader despite the distance. "Alone, it seems." Adahi was already moving toward the trapdoor, responding to their established protocol without needing to be told. "Be careful," he whispered before disappearing into the darkness below. "He is not a man who listens." Abigail replaced the rug over the trapdoor, straightened her hair, and took a deep breath to compose herself. Nathan Crawford was not a man she particularly wished to entertain, but neither was he someone she could afford to antagonize. Not now. The knock, when it came, was authoritative. 3 sharp raps that seemed to demand rather than request entry. Abigail opened the door to find Nathan on her threshold, his tall frame blocking the winter light, his face ruddy from exertion and cold. "Mrs. Harlow," he greeted her with a nod that managed to seem both courteous and condescending. "May I come?" "Indeed, Mr. Crawford," she returned evenly, stepping aside. "This is an unexpected visit, especially given the conditions. Please warm yourself by the fire." Nathan entered, removing his hat but keeping his heavy coat on, a tacit statement that he did not intend to stay long. He was a handsome man, in the conventional sense, with strong features and clear blue eyes, but there was a hardness to his mouth that Abigail had always found telling. "I apologize for the intrusion," he said, though his tone suggested he felt entitled to intrude. "Wherever he pleased. But after William's report, I felt it necessary to check on you personally." "How thoughtful," Abigail replied, careful to keep any trace of irony from her voice. "Though as you can see, I'm quite well. The storm was fierce, but my supplies are adequate." Nathan warmed his hands by the fire, his gaze sweeping the cabin with the practiced assessment of a man accustomed to evaluating property. "William mentioned you had some unusual items in your possession, native artifacts. So that was the purpose of his visit. Not concern for her welfare, but suspicion." "Hardly artifacts," she replied lightly. "Just a small beaded pouch, found by the river. I have an interest in handicrafts, as you may know. I study different techniques. May I see it?" It wasn't really a request. Abigail retrieved the pouch from her sewing basket, where she had deliberately placed it that morning, anticipating this possibility. She handed it to Nathan, who examined it with more attention than the simple object warranted. "This is Cherokee work," he stated flatly. "Recent too, by the look of it." "Is it?" Abigail feigned ignorance. "I wouldn't know the difference between Cherokee, Creek, or any other tribe's handiwork. As I told William, I found it while gathering herbs last autumn." Nathan turned the pouch over in his large hands. "And you found nothing else? No other signs of visitors?" The way he emphasized the last word made its true meaning clear. Intruders, trespassers, enemies. "Nothing," Abigail replied steadily. "I've seen no one since the first snow fell, save for my trip to the settlement before the recent storm and William's visit with young Silas." Nathan returned the pouch, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Harlow, Abigail, I must be direct. There is reason to believe a band of Cherokee warriors has crossed into settlement territory. Their purpose is unknown, but given the tensions surrounding the removal act, we must assume it isn't peaceful." "Surely that's speculation," Abigail countered, unable to entirely suppress her frustration. "The Cherokee have maintained peace for years now. Why would they risk conflict?" "Because they're desperate," Nathan said flatly. "The government has given them a choice: move west peacefully or be forcibly relocated. Some have accepted this reality, others—" he shrugged expressively. "Well, desperate men make foolish decisions." Abigail thought of Adahi hidden beneath the floorboards, listening to this man speak of his people as if they were unreasoning animals rather than human beings with legitimate grievances. Her hands itched to slap the smug certainty from Nathan's face, but she maintained her composure. "What does this have to do with me?" she asked instead. Nathan's expression softened into what he clearly believed was concern, but struck Abigail as patronizing. "You're isolated here, vulnerable. If these Cherokee are scouting for targets, an outlying cabin like yours would be an obvious choice, a woman alone." "I'm hardly defenseless," Abigail reminded him, nodding toward the rifle mounted above the door. "Thomas taught me to shoot before he passed." "A rifle is cold comfort against a war party," Nathan countered. He hesitated, then continued in a tone that suggested he was extending a great favor. "I've come to offer you protection, temporary accommodation in town until this situation resolves itself." The offer sent a chill through Abigail that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the cabin's walls. To accept would mean abandoning Adahi, unthinkable, yet to refuse too vehemently would only heighten Nathan's suspicions. "It's a kind offer," she said carefully, "but unnecessary. The storm has made travel difficult, and I'd rather not leave my animals untended. Besides, my root cellar is here with my winter stores. In town, I'd be another mouth to feed from the community supplies." Nathan frowned, clearly unused to having his generosity declined. "It's not just about practicalities, Abigail. It's about safety, about doing what's proper." There it was, the real motivation behind his concern, not her welfare but proprieties. A widow living alone was an anomaly, a disruption to the social order Nathan and men like him sought to maintain. Her independence was an affront to their sense of how the world should be arranged. "I appreciate your concern," she said, injecting warmth into her voice that she did not feel. "Truly, but I've managed 2 winters on my own now. I see no reason this one should be different." Nathan studied her with narrowed eyes. "William mentioned you've been resistant to the idea of remarriage. That's your right, of course. But consider how much easier life would be with a man's protection and provision." The conversation had taken the turn Abigail had feared. Martha's gossip about Nathan's interest had not been idle speculation, it seemed. She chose her next words with extreme care. "Grief takes time, Mr. Crawford. Thomas and I were married for 15 years. The wound of his passing is still fresh." It was a lie. The sharp pain of Thomas's death had long since mellowed into a quiet ache that was simply part of her, like the old injury to her left knee that troubled her in damp weather. But Nathan Crawford was the sort of man who understood grief as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a journey to be traveled, and she needed an excuse he would accept. 2 years is more than adequate for mourning," Nathan said dismissively. "Life continues, Mrs. Harlow. The settlement needs strong families, children. The future belongs to those who build it." Abigail bit back a retort about the irony of speaking about the future while driving those who had inhabited this land for generations from their homes. Instead, she adopted an expression of demure consideration. "You've given me much to think about," she said, moving subtly toward the door to signal the visit's end. "And I'm grateful for your concern. Perhaps when spring comes and the threat you perceive has passed, we might discuss these matters further." Nathan looked as if he might press the issue, but a glance at the rapidly darkening sky apparently convinced him to defer. "Very well," he conceded, retrieving his hat. "But my offer of protection remains open. Should you reconsider, send word with anyone traveling to town." "I will bear that in mind," Abigail promised, opening the door. "Safe journey back, Mr. Crawford. The path can be treacherous in the gathering dark." After securing the cabin against the night and the cold, Abigail lifted the trapdoor. "You can come up now," she called softly. He's gone." Adahi emerged from the root cellar, his face solemn in the firelight. "He wants you for wife," the boy observed with his usual directness. "And he fears my father's coming." "You heard everything." "And then," Abigail sighed, sinking into her rocking chair. "Enough," Adahi confirmed, settling cross-legged on the hearth rug. "He speaks of us as if we are animals." Not all settlers think as he does," Abigail felt compelled to point out, though she knew it was cold comfort. "Some understand that the Cherokee have as much right to dignity and self-determination as any people. But they do not speak against men like him," Adahi countered with the merciless logic of the young. "Their silence is agreement." The observation struck uncomfortably close to home. How many times had Abigail herself remained quiet at town gatherings when conversation turned to the Indian problem? How often had she buried her discomfort beneath platitudes about progress and manifest destiny? It had been easier to look away, to focus on her own struggles, rather than recognize the injustice being perpetrated in the name of civilization. "You're right," she admitted, surprising herself as much as the boy. "Silence, when faced with wrongdoing, is its own form of complicity. I've been guilty of it myself." Adahi tilted his head, considering her with those eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "But you speak now," he observed. "You hide me from men who would harm me. You choose differently." There was no judgment in his tone, just a simple statement of fact. Yet it resonated within Abigail like a bell, struck at precisely the right frequency, setting something deep inside her, vibrating with recognition. Yes, she had chosen differently this time. One small choice that had altered the course of her life in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. "What will happen," she asked quietly, "when your father finds you, when he comes with his warriors to reclaim his son?" Adahi's expression remained unreadable. "He will honor one who saved his child," he said with certainty. "This is our way, but the others—" He gestured vaguely toward the settlement. "They will see only enemies. Bah! And Nathan Crawford is preparing for battle, not diplomacy," Abigail murmured, more to herself than to the boy. "If blood is shed, it won't matter who struck first. All Cherokee will be blamed." They sat in somber silence as darkness claimed the world outside, each lost in thoughts of what the coming days might bring. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Abigail found herself studying these ephemeral shapes, now a bird in flight, now a running deer, now a tall figure with arms outstretched. Omens, perhaps, or merely the random play of light and shadow. "We should prepare," she said finally, rousing herself from reverie. "If your father is indeed searching for you, and if Nathan's militia is patrolling the area, a confrontation seems inevitable. We need to find a way to prevent it." Adahi nodded solemnly. "How?" It was a question Abigail had been turning over in her mind since William and Silas's visit. How to facilitate a reunion between father and son without bloodshed. How to navigate between two worlds, increasingly poised for conflict. "I need to meet your father before Crawford's men do," she said slowly, the plan taking shape as she spoke. "I need to explain the situation, arrange a peaceful handover." "But how will you find him?" Adahi asked, his young face creased with worry. "The forest is vast." Abigail leaned forward, taking the boy's small hands in her own. "You said he would come to the river where you were lost. We need to leave a sign there, something he would recognize as coming from you, something that would tell him where to find you and to come alone or with only a few trusted men, not his full war party." Excitement flashed across Adahi's face. "I can make a marker," he said eagerly, "a special sign only my father would understand." "Good," Abigail nodded. "And I'll need to create a diversion, something to draw Nathan and his militia away from this area for at least a day." It was a desperate plan, fraught with risk. If Nathan discovered her deception, she would face consequences beyond mere social disapproval. If Adai's father misinterpreted her intentions, she might find herself facing an angry warrior with no common language to explain herself. Yet what alternative remained? To wait passively as tensions escalated, as two groups of armed men moved inexorably toward a confrontation that could only end in tragedy. As if reading her thoughts, Adahi squeezed her hands gently. "It will work," he said with a child's unfounded optimism. "My father is wise. He will understand." Abigail managed to smile, drawing strength from the boy's confidence, if not sharing it entirely. "Then we begin tomorrow," she decided. "The sooner you're reunited with your people, the safer you'll be." They spent the remainder of the evening making preparations. Adahi worked intently on a small wooden token, carving intricate symbols whose meaning he wouldn't explain. "Family marks," he said simply, "private messages." Meanwhile, Abigail gathered supplies she might need for her own part of the plan. Flints for fire starting, scraps of red cloth, an old tin horn Thomas had used for hunting calls. As they worked, a curious calm settled over them both. The focused tranquility that often comes when a difficult decision has finally been made. Whatever happened now, they would face it together, a most unlikely alliance forged in the crucible of winter's isolation and humanity's oldest bond, the protection of a child. Outside, the temperature continued to drop, stars glittering like shards of ice in the black vault of the sky. Somewhere in the vast wilderness, a Cherokee peace chief led his warriors through the snow, searching for his lost son. And in the settlement below, men with rifles and suspicion in their hearts prepared to defend what they considered theirs against perceived invaders. Between these approaching forces stood Abigail Harlow's small cabin, a fragile haven soon to become the nexus of a conflict generations in the making. As she banked the fire for the night, Abigail found herself wondering, could the actions of one ordinary woman and one extraordinary child truly alter the course of events set in motion long before either of them was born? The answer lay somewhere in the uncertain future, waiting to be revealed when dawn broke over the frozen river that had brought them together and might now tear them apart. Dawn arrived with uncertain light, the sun obscured behind a veil of high, thin clouds that turned the sky the color of tarnished silver. Abigail woke before first light, her mind already racing with the day's dangerous tasks. Beside the hearth, Adahi slept peacefully, one small hand curled around the wooden token he had spent hours carving the night before. In sleep, the careful composure he usually maintained slipped away, revealing the child beneath the stoic exterior. She watched him for a moment, struck by the overwhelming urge to protect him, not just from the immediate threats of cold or hunger or hostile settlers, but from the broader dangers of a world determined to erase his people's way of life. It was a futile desire, she knew. No single person could stand against the tide of history that was even now washing over the Cherokee nation. But perhaps, just perhaps, she could ensure that this one child was reunited with his father, that this one family remained unbroken amidst the larger fracturing. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she moved to stoke the fire. Adahi stirred, eyes opening immediately, fully alert in the way of those accustomed to danger. "It's time?" he asked, sitting up and folding his blanket with practiced efficiency. "Soon," Abigail confirmed. "First, we eat. The day ahead will demand strength." They shared a simple meal of cornmeal porridge, sweetened with the last of their maple sugar, a small luxury Abigail had been saving, but which now seemed appropriate for what might be their final breakfast together. Neither spoke much, each lost in thoughts of what lay ahead. After cleaning their bowls, Adahi retrieved his wooden token from beside his bedroll. In the morning light, Abigail could see it clearly for the first time, a small disc of pine, its surface carved with intricate symbols she couldn't decipher, though she recognized the figure of what appeared to be a hawk with outstretched wings. "This will speak to my father," the boy explained, handling the token with reverence. "Tell him who sends it, where to find me, that I am safe." "All that in such a small thing?" Abigail marveled, impressed by the complexity of meaning contained in the seemingly simple carving. Adahi nodded. "Cherokee writing tells much with little." He traced one of the symbols with his fingertip. "This is my name in our letters. This," he indicated a series of curved lines, "shows the path to this cabin. And this," his finger moved to the hawk figure, "tells him I am watched over by Tsiskwa, the red hawk we saw together." The mention of the hawk they had observed days earlier touched Abigail deeply. That the boy had incorporated this shared experience into his message to his father suggested a level of trust and connection she hadn't fully appreciated until this moment. "It's beautiful work," she said honestly. "Your father will be proud of your skill." A rare smile illuminated Adahi's face, transforming his solemn features. "He taught me to listen to the wood, to find the shape waiting inside." The smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. "I miss him." The simple admission, spoken without self-pity but with quiet dignity, tightened Abigail's throat with emotion. "You'll see him soon," she promised, hoping desperately that she could make good on those words. They finalized their plan over the remains of the breakfast fire. Abigail would journey to the bend in the river where she had pulled Adahi from the ice. There, she would place his token in a specific location, a hollow in a lightning-struck oak that stood sentinel over that stretch of water. According to Adahi, his father would certainly investigate this tree, as it was a traditional marker used by Cherokee hunters to leave signs for one another. Meanwhile, Adahi would remain hidden in the root cellar, emerging only if Abigail gave their established signal upon her return. If she did not return by nightfall, he was to wait until full darkness, then make his way east along the river until he found his people. It was a desperate contingency, sending a child alone into the winter wilderness. But they both understood the stakes should Nathan Crawford discover Abigail's deception. "Be careful," Adahi said as Abigail bundled herself against the cold. It wasn't a childish plea, but a warrior's admonition, delivered with grave seriousness. "I will," she promised, checking that her small knife was secure in its sheath at her belt. Not much protection against men with rifles, but better than nothing. "And you remain hidden, no matter what you hear. Promise me." "I promise," the boy nodded solemnly, "until you return, or the stars are fully bright." Abigail hesitated at the door, suddenly reluctant to leave. What if this was the last time she saw him? What if her plan failed, and instead of facilitating a peaceful reunion, she unwittingly led Crawford's militia to Enola and his warriors? The weight of potential consequences pressed upon her like a physical burden. As if sensing her doubts, Adahi approached, taking her mittened hand in his smaller one. "The spirits guide our steps," he said with simple conviction, "like they guided you to the river that day." His faith steadied her. "Yes," she agreed, squeezing his hand gently. "Now down below until I return." She watched as he descended into the root cellar, raising a small hand in farewell before she lowered the trapdoor and secured it with the rug. Only then did she step out into the winter morning, locking the cabin door behind her. The forest received her in silence, the only sound the crunch of her boots breaking through the crusted snow. The path down to the river was treacherous, especially with recent drifts obscuring familiar landmarks. Twice she nearly lost her footing on ice, hidden beneath innocent-looking snow, but determination drove her forward, each step bringing her closer to the bend in the river where this journey had begun. When she reached the shore, Abigail paused to catch her breath, surveying the scene. The ice had reformed since Adahi's fall, though dark patches suggested areas where the current ran too strong for solid freezing. The memory of that day remained vivid, the crack that split the air, the desperate plunge of her arms into frigid water, the weight of the child's waterlogged body as she dragged him to safety, a moment that had altered the course of 2 lives. The lightning-struck oak stood on the far bank, its split trunk creating a natural shrine of sorts. Crossing to it would require traversing the frozen river, a prospect that sent a shiver of apprehension through Abigail's body. The ice had proven treacherous once before. Would it hold her weight, or was she risking the same fate that had nearly claimed Adahi? No alternative presented itself. The token must be placed in the hollow of that specific tree, or Enola might never find it. Gathering her courage, Abigail stepped cautiously onto the ice, testing each footfall before committing her weight. The surface creaked ominously in places but held. She moved slowly, breath suspended, until finally reaching the opposite shore. The oak loomed above her, its lightning scar a pale wound against the dark bark. Following Adahi's instructions, she located the hollow near the base of the trunk, a natural cavity just large enough to insert her hand. Inside, her fingers encountered smooth wood, worn by generations of messages left and retrieved. She placed the token deep within, ensuring it wouldn't be visible to casual observation, but would be discovered by someone specifically searching this traditional marker. Task completed. Abigail turned to retrace her steps across the ice. That's when she noticed the tracks, fresh impressions in the snow along the riverbank heading east. Multiple sets made by men wearing the distinctive boots favored by settlers rather than the softer footwear of the Cherokee. Nathan Crawford's militia patrolling the boundary line. Heart pounding, Abigail quickened her pace, anxious to reach the safety of her cabin before being discovered. If Crawford's men found her here, at the exact spot where a Cherokee child had fallen through the ice, their suspicions would surely be aroused. Her boots slipped on the slick surface as she hurried, nearly sending her sprawling. Caution, she reminded herself. Haste could prove fatal on treacherous ice. She had nearly reached the north bank when voices drifted through the trees. Men's voices, accompanied by the distinctive metallic sound of rifles being adjusted in their carrying straps. Crawford's militia, and they were approaching the river. Panic fluttered in Abigail's chest. If she continued forward, she would emerge from the riverbank directly in their path. If she retreated, they would still spot her on the open expanse of ice. Trapped between equally dangerous options, she made a desperate decision. Dropping to her hands and knees, she crawled toward a snow-covered boulder that protruded from the riverbank. Hoping its bulk would conceal her from view, she pressed herself against the cold stone, making herself as small as possible, and waited. 3 men emerged from the tree line, not 20 yards from her position. Nathan Crawford led them, his tall figure unmistakable even at a distance. Beside him walked Silas Jenkins, the blacksmith's son, who had found Adahi's medicine pouch. The third man was unfamiliar to Abigail, perhaps one of the newer settlers from the Southern Valley. "Waste of time," Silas was saying as they approached the river's edge. "If they were going to cross, they'd have done it by now." "Patience, boy," Crawford replied, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Cherokee move like shadows in these woods. Just because we haven't seen them doesn't mean they aren't watching us." The third man spat into the snow. "Ought to just burn them out," he muttered. "Savages understand fire well enough." "That kind of talk helps no one," Crawford admonished, though without much conviction. "We're here to protect the settlement, not start a war." "Bit late for that," Silas commented. "Government's already made its decision. Sooner or later they'll either go west peaceful-like or be driven there." He gestured across the river. "This land'll be ours within the year, mark my words." Crawford made no reply, his attention caught by something on the ice. Abigail's breath seized in her throat as she realized what he had spotted. Her tracks, leading from the north bank to the lightning-struck oak and back. "Someone's crossed recently," Crawford observed, kneeling to examine the impressions more closely. "These are fresh." Silas joined him, rifle held ready, as if expecting an attack at any moment. "Cherokee," Crawford shook his head. "Boot prints. One of ours." His head lifted, gaze sweeping the area. "Someone from the settlement's been meeting with them." The accusation hung in the frigid air, terrible in its implications. Abigail remained motionless behind her boulder, fear a metallic taste in her mouth. To be labeled a collaborator would mean ostracism at best, violence at worst. The settlement dealt harshly with those perceived as traitors to their own kind. "Could be a trapper," the third man suggested. "Johnson sometimes works this stretch of river." "Maybe," Crawford conceded, though he sounded unconvinced. "Spread out, check the banks for any sign of where they went. I want to know who's been crossing the boundary." The men separated, moving along the riverbank in different directions. Silas Jenkins headed directly toward Abigail's hiding place, his young face set in lines of grim determination. She pressed herself harder against the boulder, willing her dark cloak to blend with the stone. 20 feet. 15. If he continued on his current path, discovery was inevitable. A sound broke the tension, a distant crack, like a branch breaking under heavy weight. All three men froze, attention immediately diverted toward the eastern forest. "There," Crawford hissed, gesturing for the others to join him. "Someone's moving through the trees." Without further discussion, the men melted into the forest, rifles at the ready, all thoughts of mysterious tracks apparently forgotten. Abigail remained hidden until the sound of their passage had faded completely, then released the breath she'd been holding in a cloud of vapor. The diversion, for surely it had been intentional, had saved her from discovery. But who had created it? Had Adahi disobeyed her instructions and left the cabin? Or was it something else, someone else? The thought that Enola and his warriors might already be closer than anyone realized sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Taking advantage of the militia's distraction, Abigail scrambled up the bank and hurried through the trees toward home, no longer bothering with stealth, concerned only with reaching Adahi before Crawford and his men returned. The uphill climb left her winded, her legs burning with exertion. She stumbled once, catching herself against a pine trunk, bark rough beneath her mittened hands. The cabin appeared unchanged when she finally crested the ridge, smoke rising steadily from the chimney, no signs of disturbance. Relief flooded through her as she crossed the clearing and unlocked the door with trembling fingers. "Adahi," she called softly, moving immediately to the trapdoor. "It's safe to come up now." The boy emerged from the root cellar looking exactly as she had left him, his expression transforming from anxiety to relief as he saw her unharmed. "You placed the token?" he asked urgently. "Yes," Abigail confirmed, removing her snow-covered cloak. "In the hollow of the lightning oak, just as you instructed." Adahi nodded, satisfaction evident in his posture. "Now we wait," he said simply. "My father will come." Abigail hesitated, unsure whether to share what she had witnessed by the river. Would it frighten the child unnecessarily to know how close Crawford and his men had come to discovering her? Would it give him false hope to mention the mysterious sound that had drawn them away at the crucial moment? In the end, honesty seemed the wiser course. Crawford was there, she admitted, sinking into her rocking chair. He and two others patrolling the river. They saw my tracks on the ice. Alarm flashed across Adahi's face. "They know it was you?" "No," she shook her head. "But they know someone from the settlement crossed to the Cherokee side. They would have found me, but..." She paused, uncertain how to describe what had happened. Something distracted them. A sound in the forest. To the east, they went to investigate. A curious expression crossed the boy's face, not surprise, but a kind of knowing satisfaction. Watchful eye, he murmured, almost to himself. Already there. What do you mean? Abigail pressed, suddenly alert. Adi, do you think your father's people are already here, on this side of the river? The boy met her gaze steadily. My father would send scouts ahead, he said with certainty, to learn the land, find safe paths. His hand went to the tiny medicine pouch around his neck to watch over his son. The implication sent a ripple of unease through Abigail's body. Had Cherokee warriors been observing her cabin all along? Had they seen her pull Adahi from the river, witnessed her care for him through the long days of his recovery? The thought was both comforting and disturbing, knowing that help might have been closer than she realized, yet unsettling to think unseen eyes had been watching her every movement. Why didn't they simply take you if they knew where you were? She wondered. Aloud, Adahi considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. Perhaps they needed to be sure, he suggested, to know if you meant harm or help, or perhaps... He hesitated, then continued with quiet dignity. Perhaps they respected your right to the child you saved. The concept struck Abigail as profound. The idea that these supposed savages might recognize and honor moral complexities that men like Nathan Crawford dismissed entirely. That they might understand the bond that forms when one life preserves another, regardless of the differences between them. Your people are wiser than mine give them credit for, she said softly. Adahi's expression remained solemn, but his eyes warmed at the acknowledgement. Not all wisdom wears the same face, he replied, his English remarkable for one so young. My grandmother says truth speaks in many voices. They spent the remainder of the day in a state of heightened vigilance, taking turns watching from the cabin's windows for any sign of approach, whether from Crawford's militia returning from their patrol or from Cherokee scouts responding to Adahi's token. The boy occupied himself by completing the small turtle carving he had been working on for days, his knife moving with delicate precision over the wood. Why a turtle? Abigail asked, curious about his choice of subject. Turtle carries the world on its back, Adahi explained without looking up from his work. Steady, patient, enduring, like you. He glanced up then, a hint of shyness behind his usual composure. It is a gift, to remember. Emotion caught in Abigail's throat, unexpected and powerful. This child, who had every reason to view white settlers with fear and resentment, had crafted a gift for her, not out of obligation, but from genuine affection. I need no token to remember you, Adahi, she said gently, but I will treasure it always. The boy nodded, seeming satisfied with her response. He returned to his carving, adding fine details to the turtle's shell with the tip of his knife. The firelight caught the angles of his face, highlighting cheekbones that would one day sharpen into the strong features of a warrior. Yet there was something vulnerable in his bent head, in the careful way he held his small body that reminded Abigail forcefully of his youth. What future awaited this child, she wondered, in a world increasingly hostile to his existence? Would the government's removal plans spare his band, or would they too be forced to abandon their ancestral lands for unknown territories in the West? Would the skills he was learning now, carving, tracking, the ancient wisdom of his people, sustain him through the changes to come, or would they become relics of a way of life, deliberately extinguished? These questions had no answers, at least none that Abigail could provide. All she could offer was this moment of safety, this brief respite, before the inevitable confrontation that would determine Adahi's immediate fate, if not his distant future. As dusk gathered, Abigail prepared a simple meal. The last of their salted venison simmered with dried herbs and the few remaining root vegetables from her cellar. They ate in companionable silence, each aware that this might be their final evening together. When Adai had finished, he carefully placed his completed turtle carving on the table before Abigail. "It speaks your name now," he said, indicating tiny symbols he had added to the turtle's shell, in Cherokee writing. Abigail picked up the carving, turning it to catch the firelight. The turtle sat on a small base, its head extended as if looking toward some distant horizon, its shell adorned with intricate patterns that she now understood were not merely decorative but meaningful. "How do you say thank you in Cherokee?" she asked, deeply touched by the gift. "Wado," Adahi replied, the word flowing musically from his tongue. "Wado," Abigail repeated, doing her best to match his pronunciation. "For everything." The boy nodded once, accepting her gratitude with the quiet dignity that characterized him. They sat together as darkness claimed the world outside, the fire casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. There seemed no need for further words. Their actions over the past days had spoken more eloquently than language ever could. Later, as Adahi slept by the hearth, Abigail remained awake, too tense for rest. She sat by the window, watching as clouds parted to reveal a night sky brilliant with stars. The moon, nearly full, cast a silvery glow over the snow-covered landscape, transforming the familiar into something alien and beautiful. Her thoughts turned to Thomas. What would he have made of the situation she now found herself in? Her husband had been a fair man, more educated than most frontier settlers, less quick to judgment. Yet he had also been a product of his time and place, raised to view progress as inevitable and the displacement of native peoples as regrettable but necessary. Would he have understood her choice to shelter a Cherokee child, to defy men like Nathan Crawford in pursuit of a justice larger than settlement law? She would never know, of course. Thomas was gone, and the woman he had left behind had changed in ways he might not recognize. Grief and solitude had reshaped her, stripping away certainties, forcing her to rely on her own judgment rather than deferring to external authorities. The Abigail who had pulled Adahi from the frozen river was not the same woman who had once been content to stand silently beside her husband at town gatherings, listening as men decided the fate of peoples they barely understood. A flicker of movement at the forest's edge caught her attention. Abigail tensed, straining to see through the moonlit darkness. Nothing moved for several moments. Then, unmistakably, a figure detached itself from the shadows of the pines. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the fluid grace of one accustomed to navigating wilderness. Not Crawford or any other settler she recognized. Her heart began to pound. The Cherokee had come. As she watched, frozen in place by a mixture of relief and apprehension, a second figure emerged from the trees. Then a third. They paused at the edge of the clearing, making no move to approach the cabin, simply observing. Waiting. Abigail glanced at Adahi, still sleeping peacefully by the hearth. Should she wake him, or approach the warriors alone first, establishing her peaceful intentions? The decision was momentous, the consequences of choosing wrong potentially fatal. Drawing a deep breath, she rose from her seat by the window. She would face them directly, woman to warriors, with open hands and honest words. It seemed the only path forward worthy of the trust Adahi had placed in her. Wrapping her shawl around her shoulders, Abigail moved quietly to the door, careful not to wake the sleeping child. Her hand hesitated on the latch. Once she stepped outside, there would be no turning back. She would be at the mercy of men with every reason to distrust her kind, armed men who had possibly been watching her for days. The face of the boy sleeping by her hearth rose in her mind. His solemn eyes, his quiet dignity, his unwavering faith that his father would come for him. Faith in her as well, that she would do what was right despite the cost. Abigail unlatched the door and stepped out into the moonlight. The night air struck her face with surprising force, the cold intense after the cabin's warmth. She stood on her small porch, making no sudden movements, allowing the Cherokee warriors to observe her clearly. In the silver light, she could now distinguish 6 figures at the forest's edge, not just 3, as she had initially thought. They remained motionless, waiting for her to make the first gesture. Slowly, deliberately, Abigail raised both hands, palms forward, showing herself to be unarmed. Then she took a single step forward and another, moving away from the cabin's protection and into the open clearing. One of the warriors separated from the group, advancing to meet her. He moved, with controlled power, each step placed with precision despite the deep snow. As the distance between them narrowed, Abigail could make out his features, strong, handsome in a severe way, marked by the same high cheekbones that characterized Adahi's face. His hair was worn longer than the boy's, decorated with a single, feather secured at the temple. He carried no visible weapon, though Abigail had no doubt he was armed. They stopped perhaps 10 paces apart, regarding each other across the moonlit snow. The warrior's dark eyes studied her with intensity, revealing nothing of his thoughts. Abigail met his gaze directly, refusing to show fear, though her heart hammered in her chest. "You have something that belongs to me," the man said in perfect accented English. The sound of his voice, deep, measured, unexpected in its clarity, nearly made Abigail step back in surprise. Instead, she nodded once, acknowledging the truth of his statement. "Your son is safe," she replied, matching his directness. "I pulled him from the river 7 days ago. He has been under my protection since." The warrior's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Perhaps relief, perhaps suspicion. "I am Enola," he said simply. "Black Fox." "Abigail Harlow," she responded. Then, remembering what Adahi had told her about his father's position, "Your son told me you are a peace chief among your people." This clearly surprised him, though he controlled his reaction well. "Adahi has spoken to you of our ways." "We have learned much from each other," Abigail confirmed. "He is an exceptional child, brave, intelligent, respectful of both his traditions and mine." Enola seemed to consider her words carefully. "The token he left spoke of kindness from a widow woman," he said finally. "Of shelter freely given, of hands that heal." He paused, studying her with renewed intensity. It said nothing of conditions for his return. Abigail understood immediately what lay behind his statement, the question of whether she expected payment or reward for saving his son, whether this was some elaborate trap. Her response came without hesitation. "There are no conditions," she said firmly. "Adahi is your son. He belongs with his people, with you." She gestured toward the distant settlement. "But there are men patrolling the river, armed men who fear your presence here. If they discover you have crossed to this side—" "We know of these men," Enola interrupted. "We have observed their movements for 3 days now." His voice took on a harder edge. "They trespass on lands promised to us by treaty, then claim we are the invaders." The injustice of it struck Abigail anew, hearing it stated so plainly. "Yes," she acknowledged, making no attempt to defend the indefensible. "It has been a revelation. To see these matters through your son's eyes, through yours." Something in Enola's posture eased slightly at this admission. "You pulled my son from death's waters," he said. "For this, you have my people's gratitude. I would see him now." "Of course," Abigail nodded. "He sleeps by the hearth. I didn't wake him, thinking it better to speak with you first." As they turned toward the cabin, a sound shattered the night's stillness, the distant crack of a rifle shot, followed by shouts from the direction of the river. Enola froze, his body suddenly taut with alertness. The warriors at the forest's edge melted back into the shadows, disappearing as completely as if they had never been. "Crawford's militia," Abigail breathed, fear clutching at her throat. "They must have seen your scouts." Enola's expression hardened into something dangerous. "Go inside," he commanded. "Wake my son. We must move quickly." He raised his hand, in a series of quick gestures, communicating silently with his hidden warriors. Abigail hurried back to the cabin, heart racing. The peaceful reunion she had hoped for was rapidly dissolving into the very confrontation she had sought to prevent. As she reached for the door, another shot rang out, closer this time. The night was shattering around them, the carefully laid plans crumbling beneath the weight of events beyond their control. Inside, Adahi was already awake, standing alert by the window, his small face tense with apprehension. "My father?" he asked as Abigail entered. "Yes," she confirmed, gathering his few belongings with shaking hands. "He's outside. But Crawford's men are coming. You must go, quickly." The boy moved without hesitation, pulling on the moccasins she had crafted for him from scraps of leather. He reached for his medicine pouch, securing it around his neck, then turned to Abigail with solemn eyes. "You should come with us," he said unexpectedly. "They will know you helped me." The offer stunned her momentarily. To flee with them, to abandon everything she had known for an uncertain future, among people who might view her with suspicion at best, hostility at worst. It was unthinkable. Yet standing her ground meant facing Nathan Crawford's judgment, punishment for harboring a Cherokee child, for defying the settlement's unwritten rules about loyalty and separation. Before she could respond, the door opened again. Enola stood on the threshold, his powerful presence filling the small cabin. "Adahi," he said, his voice softening as he beheld his son. "Father." The boy flew across the room, dignity forgotten in the joy of reunion. Enola knelt, enfolding his child in a fierce embrace that spoke volumes about the anguish of their separation. Abigail turned away, giving them privacy in this moment that belonged to them alone. She busied herself gathering supplies, dried meat, a water flask, an extra blanket that might prove useful in their flight. It was little enough to offer, but all she had to give. The embrace ended too soon, broken by the sound of voices approaching from the direction of the river. Enola rose, once again the warrior chief, rather than the relieved father. "We must go," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Crawford's men approach from the south. My warriors hold them back for now, but they are many. Take these," Abigail urged, pressing the supplies into his hands. "The nights are bitter cold." Enola accepted the offerings with a nod of acknowledgement. Then, to her surprise, he reached within his cloak and withdrew a small object, a beautifully crafted bracelet of polished stones and intricately worked silver. "For the life of my son," he said simply, extending it toward her, "a token of alliance between your house and mine." The gift, symbolic, precious, entirely unexpected, brought tears to Abigail's eyes. She accepted it with hands that trembled, slightly understanding that this was no mere trinket, but a declaration of kinship, a formal recognition of a bond that transcended the artificial boundaries between their peoples. "I will wear it with honor," she promised. Adahi stepped forward then, pressing the carved turtle into her hands. "Remember," he said, his young voice thick with emotion, "when the ice melts and turtles return, think of Adahi." Abigail knelt to the boy's level, meeting his solemn gaze directly. "I could never forget you," she assured him. "You have changed how I see the world, Adahi, how I see myself." The boy nodded once, understanding. Then impulsively, he threw his arms around her neck in a swift, fierce hug. "Be safe," he whispered against her ear. Another shot cracked the night, much closer now. Enola moved to the window, his expression grim. "We cannot delay," he said, turning to Abigail. "What of you? Crawford will know you sheltered my son. He will not forgive such defiance." It was the same concern Adai had expressed, and Abigail still had no clear answer. To stay meant facing the settlement's judgment alone. To flee meant abandoning everything she had built, every connection to her past life. "I'll manage," she said finally, straightening her shoulders. "This is my home. I won't be driven from it by fear." Enola studied her with new respect. "You have the heart of a Cherokee woman," he observed, "stubborn as stone, strong as river current." He hesitated, then added with quiet authority, "If you find you cannot stay, follow the river east for 2 days. Where 3 waters meet, you will find our winter camp. Ask for Black Fox. You will be welcomed." The offer, genuine. She had no doubt hung in the air between them, an unexpected door opening onto a future she had never contemplated. Before she could respond, voices sounded just beyond the clearing, Crawford's militia closing in on the cabin. "Go!" Abigail urged, moving toward the door. "I'll delay them. Give you time to reach the forest." Enola grabbed her arm, his grip, firm but not painful. "Why would you risk yourself for us?" Abigail met his intense gaze without flinching. "Because it's right," she said simply. "Because I've been silent too long while injustice was done in my name." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding beyond words, a recognition of shared values despite vastly different worlds. Enola released her arm, inclining his head in a gesture that managed to convey both gratitude and respect. "Until we meet again, Abigail Harlow," he said. Then, taking Adahi's hand, he slipped out the back window of the cabin, both vanishing into the shadows like spirits returning to their natural realm. Abigail moved to the front door, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She squared her shoulders, touched the bracelet now circling her wrist, and prepared to face whatever consequences awaited her choice. The night was still young, the confrontation barely begun, but something fundamental had shifted within her, a certainty of purpose, an alignment of action with deepest belief that left no room for regret, regardless of what the coming hours might bring. She stepped onto her porch just as Nathan Crawford emerged from the trees, rifle raised, face hard, with suspicion and barely contained anger. Behind him, 5 other men spread out in a loose semicircle, their weapons trained on the cabin. "Abigail Harlow," Crawford called, his voice carrying clearly through the cold night air. "We know they're here, Cherokee warriors on our land. Where are you hiding them?" The moment of truth had arrived, inescapable as sunrise. Abigail lifted her chin, feeling the weight of Adahi's carved turtle in one pocket, Enola's silver bracelet cool against her skin. She thought of choices made and unmade, of silence kept too long, of a boy pulled from frigid waters into an unlikely alliance that had transformed them both. "Nathan Crawford," she replied, her voice steady and clear as it carried across the moonlit clearing. "We need to talk." Crawford's eyes narrowed as he advanced across the moonlit clearing, rifle still trained on Abigail. The other men fanned out behind him, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Step aside," he commanded, reaching the bottom of the porch steps. "We know the Cherokee crossed to this side. Their tracks lead straight to your cabin." Abigail remained unmoved, her silhouette framed in the soft light spilling from her doorway. "There's no one inside," she said calmly. "You're welcome to look." Crawford studied her face, searching for deception. "You expect me to believe they just passed by? Left no sign?" "I didn't say that." Abigail's voice carried a new strength, one born of conviction rather than defiance. "A man and his child were here. They're gone now." A murmur rippled through the militiamen. Silas Jenkins stepped forward, his young face twisted with righteous anger. "See? She admits harboring them." "I admit helping a father find his lost son," Abigail corrected. "A child who nearly drowned in the river. A child I pulled from the ice and nursed back to health." Crawford's expression darkened. You had no right. That boy belonged to people who've defied government orders, who refused to relocate peacefully. That boy, Abigail interrupted, has a name. Adahi. He's 8 years old. He carves wood with his father's knife and knows the language of birds. She touched the pocket where the turtle carving rested. He's a child, Nathan, not a political bargaining piece. Something in her tone must have reached Crawford for. His rifle lowered slightly. The law is clear, Abigail. The Cherokee must move west. Those who resist put everyone at risk. What risk did that child pose? She challenged. What danger did his father present when he came seeking only his son's return? Another man spoke up from the shadows. His father? You mean the war chief leading 60 armed warriors across our borders? Peace chief, Abigail corrected. His name is Enola, Black Fox. He came for his child, nothing more. Crawford's patience visibly frayed. Enough of this. Where did they go? Which direction? Abigail gestured broadly toward the dark forest that surrounded them on 3 sides. They're gone, Nathan, melted into the night like mist on water. You won't find them now. We'll see about that, Crawford growled, signaling to his men. Silas, take 2 men and circle east. William, you and Jenkins head west along the ridge. They can't have gotten far. The men dispersed, disappearing into the shadows with practiced efficiency. Only Crawford remained, his face illuminated by the cabin's warm glow, revealing conflict beneath his stern exterior. You've made a grave error, Abigail, he said, his voice softer now but no less determined. The settlement won't stand for this. There will be consequences. She met his gaze without flinching. I understand. I made my choice with open eyes. Why? He asked, genuine bewilderment breaking through his anger. Why risk everything, your standing, your safety, for some Cherokee child? They're not your people. Perhaps that's the problem, Abigail replied thoughtfully. We draw these lines, our people, their people, as if humanity itself can be parceled out like surveyed land. She touched the silver bracelet at her wrist. I pulled a drowning child from frozen water. What would you have had me do? Let him die because his skin is darker than mine? Because his people pray to different spirits? Crawford had no immediate answer for this. He shifted his rifle uncomfortably, perhaps sensing the moral quicksand beneath his certainty. The world is changing, Abigail, he said finally. Progress demands sacrifice. The Cherokee had their time. Now it's ours. And when our time passes, she asked quietly, when some stronger force decides we too must sacrifice for their notion of progress, who will stand for us then? Their conversation was interrupted by shouts from the eastern forest, one of Crawford's search parties, their voices urgent with discovery. Crawford's head snapped toward the sound, body tensing like a predator scenting prey. They found something, he muttered, already moving away from the cabin. Abigail's heart constricted with fear. Had Enola and Adahi been discovered? Had they not made it far enough into the protective darkness before Crawford's men picked up their trail? Without conscious thought, she descended the porch steps, following Crawford toward the source of the commotion. Snow crunched beneath her boots as they crossed the clearing, entering the shadow of the pines, where darkness swallowed the moonlight. Ahead, lanterns bobbed between the trees, illuminating a small clearing where 3 militiamen stood in a loose circle, rifles aimed inward. As Abigail drew closer, heart pounding, she could make out what had captured their attention. Not Enola, not Adahi. Instead, 5 Cherokee warriors stood with hands raised in the universal gesture of non-aggression. They were armed, but had not drawn weapons, their expressions impassive despite the rifles trained upon them. Found them trying to circle behind us, Silas reported proudly. Thought they'd ambush us, I reckon. One of the warriors, older than the others, with gray streaking his dark hair, spoke in clear English. We are not here to fight. We seek only to ensure our chief's safe passage with his son. Crawford pushed forward, weapon ready. Your chief trespassed on settlement land, violated the boundary agreement. To retrieve his child, the warrior replied calmly. Would you not do the same if your son was lost in our territory? The question hung in the air, unanswerable without conceding the point. Crawford's jaw worked silently, frustration evident in every line of his body. Where are the others? He demanded. Our scout reported 60 warriors crossing the river. A flicker of something, perhaps amusement, crossed the older warrior's face. Your scout counted poorly, or perhaps he saw what fear told him to see. He gestured to his companions. We 5 were sent to ensure the boy's safe return. No more. Abigail realized suddenly that this had been Enola's strategy all along. These warriors had deliberately allowed themselves to be discovered, drawing Crawford's attention while their chief and his son slipped away in another direction. They were sacrificing their freedom, perhaps their lives, to guarantee Adai's safety. You expect me to believe that? Crawford scoffed. That your war party numbered only 5? Peace party, the warrior corrected with the same quiet dignity Abigail had observed in both Enola and his son. And yes, I expect you to verify it yourself. Send men to search. They will find no others. Crawford turned to Silas. Take Jenkins and check the western approach. William, you and Roberts continue east. I want every inch of these woods combed. As the men departed on their mission, an uneasy silence fell over the small clearing. The Cherokee warriors remained motionless, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, their eyes revealing nothing of their thoughts. Crawford kept his rifle trained on them, though Abigail noted his finger rested alongside the trigger guard, rather than on the trigger itself, a small concession to uncertainty. Minutes stretched like hours as they waited for the search parties to return. Abigail found herself studying the oldest warrior's face, noting similarities to Enola in the high cheekbones and steadfast gaze. A relative, perhaps? The man caught her looking and inclined his head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement that Crawford missed entirely. Finally, footsteps announced the searchers' return. They emerged from different directions, converging on the clearing with identical expressions of frustration. Nothing to the west, Silas reported reluctantly. Eastern section clear as well, William added. If there were others, they're long gone. Crawford's frown deepened as he processed this information. His certainty had been challenged. His fears of a massive Cherokee incursion proven unfounded. Yet he still had 5 warriors at gunpoint, concrete evidence of treaty violation regardless of the reason. Bind them, he ordered after a moment's consideration. We'll take them back to the settlement. The territorial authority can decide what to do with them. As his men moved to comply, Abigail stepped forward. Nathan, wait. They came only for a child. Surely that deserves consideration. Crawford turned to her, irritation plain on his face. They broke the law, Abigail. So did you. Don't make this worse for yourself. At least let me give them food and water for the journey, she persisted. It's a long walk to the settlement, especially in this cold. After a moment's hesitation, Crawford nodded curtly. Be quick about it. As Abigail moved toward her cabin to gather supplies, the older warrior caught her eye once more. Something passed between them, an understanding, a recognition. She hurried inside, gathering bread, dried meat, and a flask of water. When she returned, the warriors had been bound, their hands secured before them with rough rope. She approached them directly, offering the provisions with a dignity that matched their own. The older warrior accepted on behalf of the group, his fingers brushing hers deliberately as he took the food. Wado, he said quietly, thank you for saving the chief's son, for showing him another way between our peoples might exist. Abigail nodded, understanding the weight behind his simple words. Will they be safe? She whispered, concerned for Enola and Adahi. A ghost of a smile touched the warrior's lips. They cross the great river even now. By dawn, they will be beyond reach. Relief washed through her, tempered immediately by awareness of these men's sacrifice. And you? What will happen to you? The warrior shrugged slightly, a gesture of acceptance rather than indifference. We knew the risk. The boy's safe return was worth it. Enough talking, Crawford interrupted, gesturing with his rifle. Move out. We need to reach the settlement by dawn. As the procession prepared to depart, Crawford turned his attention back to Abigail. This isn't over, he warned. The settlement council will want answers. Your position here is compromised. I understand, she replied steadily. She watched as Crawford led his prisoners away, their proud figures gradually disappearing into the darkness. Only when they had vanished completely did she allow herself to return to the cabin, body suddenly heavy with exhaustion as the night's events caught up with her. Inside, the fire had burned low, casting more shadows than light. Abigail moved mechanically to stoke it, her mind replaying everything that had transpired since she first spotted Adahi on the frozen river. One impulsive act of compassion had set in motion consequences she could never have imagined. Sleep eluded her that night. She sat instead by the window, watching as stars wheeled overhead and the moon completed its arc across the sky. As first light touched the eastern horizon, she found herself thinking of Enola's parting words, his offer of sanctuary where three waters meet. The settlement would indeed demand a reckoning for her actions. Her place among them, tentative, even before this incident, was now irrevocably damaged. Yet as dawn broke over the ridge, painting the snow-covered landscape in hues of gold and rose, Abigail felt a curious lightness in her spirit. Whatever came next, whether facing the settlements, judgment, or seeking a new beginning elsewhere, she had acted according to her deepest values. She had chosen humanity over division, compassion over fear. She removed the turtle carving from her pocket, tracing its intricate designs with gentle fingers. The Cherokee symbols that spelled her name seemed to pulse with life in the morning. Light, connecting her to the child who had carved them, to the father who had offered alliance, to possibilities she had never before considered. Outside her window, a red-tailed hawk circled against the brightening sky. Tsiskwa, the watcher over warriors. Whether coincidence or sign, Abigail accepted its presence as affirmation. The path ahead might be difficult, but it would not be. Walked alone. 7 days after pulling a Cherokee child from the frozen river, Abigail Harlow faced the sunrise with clear eyes and a determined heart, ready for whatever the future might bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.